We say good morning to our Facebook friends, Coffee with Corn. Wonderful to have you all here. Looking forward to a big program again. If you do need the credits, Jim and I were just talking about that. There are credits available at the end of our broadcast today. You need to be on the Zoom to get those credits. So Facebook friends, be advised that if you do need these credits, this is the last in a series of Coffee with Corns. So you might want to make sure that you are on the Zoom if you do need those credits. And we'll have a lot more information on that at the conclusion of our program today. Questions and answers? Yes, we do. We will be taking questions, and yes, we will have answers for you. Easy to do if you're on the Zoom. Just go to the Q&A down at the bottom of your screen. Click on that. As you happen to think of a question before you forget it, it wouldn't hurt to just click on that, get the box, and type in the questions for our featured speaker or speakers, whoever you might want to question. And for those of you on Facebook, you can use your comment section on the Facebook. So we'll be monitoring all of that. And as I said, we go through the broadcast today, our meeting today. We'll be fielding those questions and get some answers right out to you. First of all, I want to say good morning officially to Jim Zook, Corn Marketing Program. Jim, before I forget, I do want to mention, first of all, congratulations to a number of individuals who were appointed directors to the Corn Marketing Program this year. I've got the list here. I don't know if you've got the list handy with you. I think I've got 4 names here.
Correct.
We've got Brett Brink from Hamilton. That's representing District 4. He was reappointed. Philip Gordon of Saline, he was appointed to represent District 3. Daniel Keenan of Merrill was appointed to represent District 8. And Scott Miller out of Elsie, he was reappointed to represent District 6. And that took place a couple of weeks ago.
Yes, and we're very happy to have our new board seated now, that we can go ahead and start to plan for the future. Again, some of those who have been on, it's like everything else. It takes a while to understand everything that corn does. And I think that what we have showcased here with these Coffee with Corns probably helps to explain to the rest of our growers and our people in agribusiness that deal with corn all the variety of different topics that we actually cover, that we actually help keep in line for our growers. And there's nobody else that will do that for corn other than what we do here at the Corn Marketing Program, as well as the Corn Growers Association.
Now, as far as our new directors are concerned, again, a couple of them were reappointed. What's the term of office there, Jim?
So our officers serve 3-year terms. Currently, our program states that we can have unlimited terms, but typically the governor will limit the terms to 3 terms. So 3-year terms. However, our program states that it can be for a longer period of time than that. So again, it seems like they get through the first half and they just are able to grasp everything that we do. And it's just a part of the learning curve, because it is like drinking out of a fire hose with everything that we do.
No, I guess so. Well, we have a very special guest today. Jim, how about you introduce our guest today?
So yes, it's my pleasure to introduce Kristen Poley. Kristen is our research person here at the Corn Marketing Program. Kristen is also a joint partnership with the Soil Health Partnership, which is an initiative with National Corn Growers Association. Again, Kristen also heads up our Crop Summit, Great Lakes Crop Summit. So we have a variety of hats for her to deal with, but her passion is around research and especially around agronomy. So with that, I'm going to kick it off to Kristen.
Yeah. Thanks, Jim. Are you seeing my presentation or are you seeing the presenter mode of the presentation?
So I think we're seeing the presenter mode where we see the next slide.
Yep. How about now?
Yep, there we go.
Great. Okay, cool. Well, thanks for that introduction, Jim and Terry. I'm happy to be here today. It's great to see so many people here for the final webinar in our Coffee with Corn series. As was said, my name is Kristen Foley. I am the research manager for the Corn Marketing Program in Michigan and also for the Soil Health Partnership. Today's presentation is going to be split into two pieces. First, I'll present some regional results coming out of the Soil Health Partnership. This includes results on soil health indicators, some yield impacts to corn, and examples of cover crop wins and losses. And then I'll switch gears a little bit and talk about some more regionally specific Michigan soil health research from 2020 and moving forward in 2021 that also has some greater implications for things like carbon. For those that maybe aren't as familiar with the Soil Health Partnership, we are an initiative of the National Corn Growers Association. The Soil Health Partnership's mission is to promote the adoption of soil health practices for economic and environmental benefits. We take a three-pronged approach to soil health. So on-farm research, some sustainable agriculture practices are trialed in on-farm research trials, where our field staff is working with the farmers to implement these practices, troubleshoot anything that may go wrong throughout the process, and then also collect data from each of those trials each year. Then our data and science team takes all that data that's collected out into the field and then analyzes it and looks at it to be able to make observations and recommendations back to the farmers and then back to anybody else who's interested in trialing out these practices. And then finally, our communications and outreach team works really hard to get that information out there to really anybody who's interested. The Soil Health Partnership includes more than 200 farmers across 16 states, and we do have, including 4 farms here in Michigan currently. The majority of our farms, 70%, are corn and soybean growers, but we also include sugar beets and wheat, and are sort of trying to dabble in some other areas as well. And 80% of our trials are cover crop trials, so trialing out cover crops, whether it's a single species or a mix of species, covering a wide variety of soil health goals that might come with those that cover crop mix. And then we also do tillage trials, so looking at reduced tillage like strip tillage, for example, comparing that to a more conventional tillage practice. And we have nutrient management trials as well. And then looking ahead to the future, we're looking to include more trials that include grazing or figuring out how we can include livestock into this system. And actually 3 of those trials here in Michigan, the brown diamonds here, those were dairy trials, the first of our kind for SHP, looking at dairy forage, cover crop forage on those farms. This diagram just kind of quickly shows what it's like to be a farmer within our SHP network throughout 1 year. Our field staff and really all of our staff are working with the farmers out in the field and also behind the scenes, helping them in every season, from soil sampling in the spring, which is what we're gearing up to do right now, through management data collection throughout the entire year and up through harvest. We are there to give technical assistance and also to collect a lot of that data. A lot of our farmers stay with us for 5 years. We have a fair amount of our farmers now that are with us for their 6 to 10 year range, which is exciting to start to get that more long-term data set. On the research side of things, we work with farmers in primarily 2 trial types. We have strip trials, which is the picture here on the left, where we have a control strip and a treatment strip, so in this case, cover crops, randomized across the field. And then we also have side-by-side trials, which is simply where a field is cut in half. Generally, this is a smaller field that maybe we want to test out some economic data where it's a little bit easier to manage halves of a field versus strips of a field. And this is also where we start to see some of our livestock initiatives starting to take shape. We collect data at the field level, at the strip level or the halves level. And then we also have a series of soil sample or in-field sampling grids that aren't shown on these fields. So that the data collection aspect really is quite intense and covers the entire field. We're going to focus today on some strip trial results. So all of that data that we collect, and there is a lot of it every year, we're trying to bring that all together in order to make observations and make recommendations about what these soil health practices are really doing for that farm and for that field and for that soil health improvement. So we're asking questions like, what soil health practice is going to help me reach this outcome? Or what actually is happening to my soil if I trial this soil health practice? And we can group these data types that we're collecting into 4 main categories, and these are across the left column here. So the first is trial information. We collect quite a bit of geospatial information, especially at the beginning of a trial when we're first enrolling a farmer. So we're determining the best location for a field, we're determining their primary soil texture types, we're determining where to sample, not only for our soil samples, but for all of our other data collection as well. We're setting up our field boundaries and we're trying to determine what our treatment is and what those questions are that we want to have answered. We're also collecting management and economic data. So we're collecting management data, pre-plant and planting data, in-season data, what they're planting, when they're planting it, what they're applying, whether or not they're applying in-season fertility, just across the whole spectrum of management data, and also economic data, which becomes really important. And all of this sort of ties in together with how to explain the agronomic data that we collect. So we collect 2 different types of agronomic data on an annual basis. The first is yield data, of course, which is very important. And then we also have a system in place for in-field agronomic observations that we call field checks, and those happen throughout the entire summer too. And we can really take those more simplified observations, but use the management and economic data to explain those outcomes and to try and make some conclusions about that soil health practice on that particular farm. And finally, we have soils data. We're looking at both soil health and fertility indicators, specifically looking at macro and micronutrients, organic matter, active carbon, aggregate stability, respiration, and so many other soil health metrics that are out there. So really, it's a pretty large data set, and we're just starting to be able to put out a lot of those results, and I have some of those results to share with you today. First, some recent results showing that cover crops can improve soil health within 3 to 5 years of use. So specifically for 4 soil health indicators, active carbon, aggregate stability, respiration, and soil organic matter, we can see that over time, these indicators are increasing, but this effect, this positive effect, is also increasing over time, which is an important aspect. So when we're looking at these graphs, the way that you want to interpret them are looking at this bottom line first, which is this green line. This is the 2015 soil sample, and then moving up through time to the darker green line on top, and that's our 2019 soil sample. And you also want to pay attention to this 0 line. This is our no effect line. So we can see that in each of these particular indicators, we're showing a positive increase over time in that cover crop and an increasingly positive increase over time in that soil health indicator. One indicator, though, that we didn't see a strong impact in is water holding capacity. Now, for me, this makes sense if we take a look at this aggregate stability chart in particular. So in aggregate stability in 2015, we had a negative effect. We had a negative soil test for aggregate stability, which is perfectly fine. And then in 2016, we see a pretty strong increase up to the positive side of that no effect line. But from there, from 2016 to 2019, we see a much smaller increase in those indicators over time. And this makes sense because aggregate stability is one of those indicators that really takes a lot of time in order to really start to build differences. But what's happening here is as you're building those water stable aggregates in your soil, the soil is going to be able to hold more water and also drain more water in a faster way. And so as we continue to collect aggregate stability over time, and if we continue to see this positive trend on the right side of this line here, I would expect in time to also see increases in water holding capacity. So this result here was just published about a month ago, and it's a really exciting find for us that we'll hope to build on with the soil test results that are coming in this year. Unfortunately, we were not able to take any soil tests in 2020, so we're skipping ahead to 2021 and starting this week actually. Switching to yield results now. So yield is, of course, a very important metric for us to look at. It's something that farmers really care a lot about and like to talk about a lot because it's an important component of profitability. But we also are hoping to show that with time and with experience in planting cover crops, we're not seeing a negative impact to our yield. And so this is 2019 yield data. At the time that I was putting this presentation together, we don't quite have the 2020 results fully analyzed yet. But if you're interested in the Soil Health Partnership's yield protocols and in some of our results from 2019 and 2020, SHP is putting on a webinar next week on Tuesday the 30th. That's going to go deeper into this. And you can find the registration for that on the website, soilhealthpartnership.org. So here I'm just going to talk about 2019 results. I have corn results here in the yellow. This is averaged across our entire network. So we're looking at any strip trial across essentially the entire Midwest that had a cover crop on it. So no tillage trials and no nutrient management trials in this result. And then I also have soybeans here on the right if that's what you're interested in and for the same scenario. For corn in the control, we see a average yield of 209.5 bushels per acre, and the treatment comes in at 208 bushels per acre. So the numbers themselves are pretty identical. And in fact, we did not see a statistically significant yield difference between the control and the treatment. And what that means is that in these fields, if there is a difference between control and treatment, it might not be because of the cover crop, but it could be because of any other management or soil factor that we just have yet to tease apart. But it's important to note that if you're just looking at this average value, we're obscuring the variability, right? So not every farm in our network came in at 209.5, that's just the average. And if we're looking at just the average, we're not seeing those tail ends and what that could mean. So I took this same graph, this yellow corn graph, and instead now we're looking at the distribution of yield for 2019. So now we can see that we have predominantly in that middle average zone, but we're also seeing stretched out all the way to 15 bushel per acre yield penalty up to about an 11 bushel per acre yield gain. So a pretty wide spread of that corn yield there. And on the soybeans, we see the same pattern, but a little bit more together. So we see 11 bushel per acre yield penalty up to about an 8 bushel per acre yield gain, and even more strongly in that center, more average zone. So the reason we want to look at this is because, you know, it's important to know that some farmers, when they plant their cover crops, especially without a lot of experience in the management aspect, they could very well be seeing a hit on their yield monitor. But we're also going to have farms that are going to see a boost to their yield each year. And it's important to be able to explain why. So we want to be able to take these tail ends, this positive and this negative, look at the management that these farmers were implementing and try and be able to understand that result. And so we're going to take these numbers, these extremes here, and I put them into a table now. We've categorized those results from the previous chart into a couple of columns. So we have first yield loss of at least 2 bushels per acre, and this is representing 4 farms in this year. We have a yield gain of more than 2 bushels per acre, and that represents 7 farms. And then we have a yield difference of within 2 bushels of 0. So that's the bulk of our farmers here. And then across down here on the left, we want to take some of these cover crop management factors that are similar across all of these farms and trying to be able to understand. So what we're interested in is whether or not they planted cereal rye as a primary cover crop species, whether they planted a mix or a single species of cover crop, what that cereal rye seeding rate was, whether the cover crop was interseeded, overseeded, or planted green, and whether it was terminated more than 2 weeks prior to planting. And I think we can pull out some really interesting pieces of information here. Looking at those 4 farms that had a yield loss of more than 2 bushels per acre, each one of them, 100%, planted cereal rye as their primary cover crop species. Now, we know a lot about the challenges of planting cereal rye before corn because they're both grasses and they can lead to some management challenges. And it looks like for these particular farms, that may have been part of the issue. They were planting cereal rye as a single species. But going deeper than that, half of the farmers planted green, which meant they were planting corn into a standing cereal rye cover crop, and then terminating that cover crop after planting. Whereas the farmers that had a yield gain of more than 2 bushels per acre, 57% of them were terminating that cereal rye cover crop more than 2 weeks prior to planting their corn crop. So when we're looking at choosing a cover crop species and considering what cash crop you're going into, it's really important to consider the species, the timing, the mix rate, and then the termination aspects as well. So I think this is a really interesting result for us. On the right side of the chart, we have right side of the slide, we have a couple of charts that are basically showing the same thing. So we have corn yield on the left with termination time on the right. And what we're seeing here is when a cereal rye cover crop is terminated within 2 weeks of planting, we're seeing the highest yields in both the control and the cover crop. And again, there's no statistical significance here, but a pretty good increase in those yields compared to when you're terminating more than 2 weeks prior to planting. And then interestingly, when you're terminating that cover crop at or after planting, we're seeing a hit on those cover crop strips that we don't see in those control strips. So I think that's a good lesson learned here when considering when you're going into corn with cover crops. On the bottom, we have corn yield and then cover crop species category across the bottom. So this is just comparing corn yield when we had a single species of cover crop compared to a mixed species of cover crop. So in this case, that's going to be anywhere from 2, 3, 4, up to maybe 12 in a mix. And we see that corn yield, interestingly, for both the treatment and the control is far less when we're looking at a mixed species cover crop compared to a single species cover crop. And this could be due to nutrient management concerns. Maybe you're having some nutrient drought from those cover crops that's not being replaced well enough or quickly enough for your cash crop, or it could be from really any other soil or management aspect too. So when we're looking at corn, a single species might be the way to go, or a reduced species at the very least, maybe a 1, 2, or 3-way mix. Now, I say all of this for corn. I think it's really important to point out that I'm not showing any soybean data here except for that first slide where I had the average yield. There is a lot of really good information coming out of the Soil Health Partnership, but also so many other organizations and universities that are showing that planting soybeans green into cereal rye can be a great option and can give you, if anything, just a no loss, no gains on the yield monitor, but possibly even yield boost too if they're managed correctly. So really important to keep in mind that corn is a different beast than soybeans in this particular example, but it can absolutely be done.
Kristen, a question we have is with regards to the termination of the cover crop, was that done with herbicide or tillage?
Yeah, that's a really good question. In this particular data, it's primarily done with herbicide. We do have A handful of farmers, especially in our southern regions, roller crimping their cereal rye even before corn, but that's just a little bit more rare because it takes longer and you have to get the cereal rye to grow longer. And we might have the occasional farmer that will till it in, but it also could be a combination of herbicide kill and then tillage too. So this graph here shows basically the same information, but in a little bit of a different way. And I think this is probably, if you take away anything from this, I think this result here is probably the thing that you should take away from if you're curious about planting cereal rye ahead of corn. We have the corn yield difference here on the left and the cereal rye feeding rate on the bottom. This blue line is a zero line. Everything above the blue line had a yield boost, and everything below the blue line had a yield penalty. So we're seeing that when we're planting cereal rye up until about 40 to 45 pounds per acre, we have a pretty good possibility of seeing a yield boost in corn, or at the very least coming in at zero with no loss, no gain. But as soon as we hit that 50 mark, 50 to 55 pounds per acre for that cereal rye, we're seeing an increased risk of a yield loss in our corn when we're planting cereal rye. So I think, again, that's something that's very different with soybeans. And I think this is even, I think this is even a little smaller than I would have expected to see. But this is a really interesting result that we got just recently. So I've spent the last, I don't know, 10 minutes telling you about how cereal rye before corn might be a little risky or a bad idea, but it absolutely can work, especially if it's managed correctly. So here I have an example of a farmer in Indiana, this is central Indiana, who planted rye before corn, and it worked out great. So he planted 35 pounds per acre of cereal rye in 10-inch rows in mid-October. He terminated the cereal rye 2 weeks before corn planting in May, when the cereal rye was 12 inches tall. The corn was planted with some starter, and then he saw a 6 bushel per acre yield bump on those cover crop strips that he didn't see on his control strip. So it absolutely is possible. And then just to look at this picture here, this picture was taken shortly after herbicide termination of the cover crop, and also just after corn planting. And we can see a pretty good mat of cereal rye that's down on the soil, and that's going to be beneficial for a couple of things. It's going to help keep that soil protected from erosion if that's a concern in this area. And it's also going to help later as we get deeper into the growing season, keep that soil moisture intact in the soil. And anecdotally, this farmer noticed less weeds in the cover crop strips where he had that mat of cereal rye residue that he didn't see in the control too. So I don't have any data to show that, but that's an observation that our field staff made from this particular field, which is definitely an interesting result. So I've been talking a lot about cereal rye, and of course, there are so many other cover crops out there that you can choose from, just depending on what cash crop you're going into next and what your soil health goals are for that season or for the long term even. But there's a reason I'm talking about cereal rye. It's a really popular cover crop, especially for beginners. This is from our 2019 cover crop survey, and it showed that half of our farmers are planting a single species cover crop, and of those, 50% are planting cereal rye. So we know that it's a very popular cover crop, not just for beginners, but also for seasoned farmers that are out there just wanting that cover crop benefit without having to do too much in terms of extra management that you might have to think about for a mix. Oats is also pretty high up there at 42%. I think oats are more popular in the northern latitudes where it should winter kill, so you have a little bit less to consider in terms of termination as well. And I think also just an interesting to note here, annual ryegrass is at the bottom. It's included in the fewest amount of mixes. We definitely, I can't think of anybody in our network currently that's doing annual ryegrass as a standalone single species. It's mostly included in mixes. And it can be pretty tricky to manage and terminate. And so it's a great cover crop. It's got a great root system and it can give you a lot of benefits, but it can also be pretty tricky. One last thing I want to highlight about cover crops before we move on is interseeding and overseeding. So we're seeing this kind of emerge as a popular method of seeding. 25% of our farmers in 2019 in our northern latitudes especially were interseeding or overseeding their cover crop in the fall. And interestingly, the majority of these farmers were aerial seeding their cover crops, which is pretty cool. Of course, that can get a little pricey. It comes in around $14 an acre, and it can also be a little bit trickier in terms of cover crop establishment. If you're not getting good seed to soil contact, and if your soil moisture isn't right when that seed gets out there, but it is a good way to get out in the field without having to run a tractor through the field, of course. The next most common method was broadcast with incorporation. So I know this just says broadcast down here, but it should be broadcast with incorporation, which means that they're tilling it in. And then finally, we had two farmers that were drilling it interseeding into standing corn about halfway through the growing season. Now, you can see here the distribution of farms in our network that are utilizing these methods, and in our northern states, this is the most popular method. We do, after this data was taken, we do have some farms in South Dakota that are also interseeding. And you don't see any data in Michigan, and that's just because in Michigan, we currently have a strip trial looking at strip tillage in a continuous corn rotation. So we're not looking at cover crops yet in Michigan, although that is the plan moving forward. And then also, like I mentioned, we have those 3 dairy sites that are looking at cover crops, but they're looking at them in terms of forage biomass for their dairy herd. And so we can't really collect quite the same amount of information from those farms. So we don't have any Michigan data for how things are getting planted from the SHP network anyway. Okay, so one last thing before we switch gears into the Michigan corn specific research. This technology here is something that SHP is looking to use more strongly in the coming year. We have one new team member who's really interested in using this. And it also is going to kind of relate to something I'll talk about in the second half of this presentation. And this is using remotely sensed data to assess outcomes of cover crops. And so what we're looking at here is an NDVI index, or a greenness index, from one field in our network last year. And this is just a really interesting story to tell. This farmer planted a rapeseed cover crop in late September. And then what we're looking at here on the chart, in the red line, that's the cover crop strips, and the blue line is the control strips. So even if we don't know anything else that happened on this field, I think just by looking at the timeline and looking at the lines on this chart, we can tell a pretty interesting story. So we have a cover crop planted in late September, and then according to our NDVI, our greenness index, something is growing out there on those cover crop strips that's not present on the control strip, and presumably that would be our cover crop, showing a higher greenness index. And we see this continue up until winter. And I've included some weather data here. So potential killing frost for rapeseed, which should winter kill. And then we see sort of this change in the cover crop and the control disappear as we get deeper into the winter. So we're at about January 1st, and we don't see any difference now between the cover crop and the control. And that's, again, presumably because we had a winter kill. There's nothing growing out there anymore. Maybe we even have some snow cover now. And we see that continue throughout the winter, where there's no difference between the two strips. But in the spring and in April, we start to see some greening up on our control strips that we don't see on our cover crop strips. So what this means is that something out here is growing on those control strips that's not happening on our cover crop strips. And what this could lead us to presume now is that we're getting some weed control benefits from that cover crop residue that the control strips just don't have. And for this particular field, we know that to be true the control strips were very weedy compared to the treatment strips. So this is something that we're looking forward to using more. Of course, this is often used during cash crop season, where you can potentially spot some differences in the field during the growing season. Then you can possibly even predict harvest losses or yield penalties from your cash crop before you even get to harvest. But I think this is a really great application to be able to use this on cover crops and try and start to tell some stories about what that cover crop is doing out there when compared to bare soil. So look for more data like this coming out of SHP. Okay.
So Kristen, before you go,
yeah,
we do have a couple questions that maybe we could answer.
Sure.
One of those questions is the carbon to nitrogen ratio is a popular topic when it comes to putting cover crop mixes together.
Yep.
Have you looked at this when evaluating the cover crop impacts on corn?
Yep. So I'm actually going to defer that question. I am going to cover carbon to nitrogen ratio in the second half of this presentation. So hang on to that one.
And then the second one is, what does planted before corn mean? Is it planted after soybeans and planted after wheat?
What is planted before corn mean? Oh, what's going on? Okay, sorry about that. So we're talking about the cereal rye would have come off generally after soybean the cereal rye we put on generally after soybeans have come off the field, because predominantly these are corn soy rotations. They're not including wheat. We do have a couple of wheat fields, but they weren't included in this particular data set. Does that make sense? Does that answer the question?
Yeah, I believe it does. If not, the person will get back to us.
Okay. So before we move on to Michigan corn specific research, we do have one more poll question I'd like to put up there. So if we can get that put on the screen for everyone. This is just a very simple question. What is your primary goal when implementing soil health practices on your farm? And you can choose more than one if you'd like. All right, we'll give it another few seconds here and we can show the results from that.
Kristen, one other question would be are you going to have these slides available? We have somebody that'd like to have them for a discussion.
Sure, yeah, we can distribute a copy of these slides. I don't think that would be a problem. Okay. Do we have the results from the poll? Here they are, great. So 78% of you responded that increasing organic matter is the primary goal. That's great. That's a very common goal, also a very achievable goal over time. Then we have nutrient cycling and availability, followed closely by erosion control, water quality, and others. So that's great. Thank you all for participating in that. So I'm going to switch gears now and talk about corn marketing program specific soil health research that we have been a part of. And I want to first thank right from the start Mid-Michigan Agronomy. They've been the engine behind a lot of this research. And a lot of this is their data that they're letting me present here today. So thanks to them for that. We're going to look at the effects of cover crop on soil microbial populations. And then we're going to start talking about carbon a little bit with effects of conservation practices on carbon retention. And so just for fun here, this picture on the right is a picture of an oat cover crop from these Mid-Michigan trials here this last year. This picture was taken just after the new year, and we do still see some pretty green growth on that oats. We had a mild winter up until this point, but after that, as you all well know, at least in this area, we had a pretty harsh cold stretch, and that oat did eventually winter kill, but just sort of the power of plants here that they're able to survive for longer than we expect them to. The corn marketing program is dedicated to enhancing the economic position of Michigan corn farmers, and research is a big part of that. So I'm just showing here real quick the breakdown of what we like to support in terms of research. Nothing really too much to take away from here, except that in recent history and moving forward, at least for the next year, market development and environmental sustainability have been big areas of focus for us, and I expect that to continue at least in the near future, as both of these things are representing issues that are not going to go away, but that we can absolutely work towards making better conditions for our Michigan farmers. But we also look into things like genetics and hybrids, soil quality, value-added uses for corn production, and so many other things. So the first project here is by Mid-Michigan Agronomy, and this is something that we got involved with last year, and it's something that I was able to be pretty deeply involved with in helping with the actual research, which is something that I'm always excited to do. We're looking at cover crops and the effect of these cover crops on microbial populations. So we're analyzing the effects of cover crops. In this particular experiment for this year, we used an oat cover crop on soil health. Last year was the first of 5 years. Planned 5 years for this trial, and it was corn. This coming year, they'll be repeating in a soybean rotation, and we have 4 different treatments for this project. So we have first a grower standard treatment, which is just corn. Second, we had a corn plus oat cover crop plus a bio grow. And I had to write them here so I wouldn't forget what they were called, because I'm not entirely familiar with biological additives. So BioGrow is the first product. And our third treatment is a corn crop plus oat cover crop plus a product from Nutrilink Biosystems, which is another additive. And then finally, we have just a corn plus oat cover crop. So these 2 biological additives here are different. Of course, they're different companies, but they have predominantly the same goal, and that is to kind of spur those microbials into action. So this BioGrow product is adding a food source to those microbes. So it's kind of relying on the microbes that are already in the soil. It's trying to spur them into action by giving them a really concentrated food source, and then hopefully they will move on to helping with the rest of the soil environment. And then the Nutrilink Biosystems is a little different in that they are introducing a food source and microbes into the soil in addition to the existing microbes that might be there. And so just 2 interesting products that were chosen for this year. As far as the data coming out of this trial, we're looking at soil tests pre-season and post-season to look at differences in the microbe community, and we are also looking at yield, of course. Okay, so we're looking at the enzyme results first. Now, the first one here on the left is the enzyme beta-glucosidase. Beta-glucosidase is an enzyme that is responsible for breaking down cellulose in the soil. It's basically pulling sugar out of cellulose or plant matter in the soil. We have here our pre-season whole field average at 48.4 parts per million. And then we have each of our treatments moving down the line. So we have first the yellow here is just our grower standard, just plain corn. And then we have our 2 biological additive cover crop treatments. And finally on the end here, we just have our corn plus oat cover crop treatment. And I think what's interesting about this with this graph here is that we see our 3 treatments with the cover crop are coming in at about the same level for beta-glucosidase as our whole field average, with our 1 Nutrilink Biosystems product, oats and corn, coming in at a pretty far lower. And I'm not sure exactly why we're seeing that with, this enzyme is considered to be a direct measurement of enzymes in the soil. It's also been found to be very sensitive to changes in the soil. So if we're adding food sources for these microbes, and these microbes are being spurred into action, we would expect that enzyme activity to be higher, and we would expect some different levels than I think what we're seeing here. So this is interesting, but I think perhaps what's even more interesting about this particular result is our grower standard, our plain corn, is much higher than our whole field preseason average, coming in at 69.1 parts per million. And I will explain that in just a little bit as we go forward. The next graph here is looking at levels of beta glucosaminidase in parts per million, which is a mouthful. This enzyme, the difference between these enzymes is minimal. They are both looking at sugars in the soil, basically. The first one here was sugars from cellulose, and the second one is sugars from amino acids from chitin in the soil. So, you know, ultimately they're doing the same thing. They're just measuring just a little bit differently. The sources of those sugars are just a little bit different. This is also considered to be a direct measurement of microbes in the soil. So it's a good measurement in terms of soil health. Again, we see the preseason whole field average coming in at 32.7 parts per million. And then good news, we see all of our treatments are exceeding that initial level, which is good. But again, we see that Nutrilink Biosystems product just struggling a little bit to catch up with the other treatments. But I want to step back for a little bit, and it sounds like this topic is something that is of concern and of interest to a lot of our people here on the call. I want to make sure that we understand the carbon to nitrogen ratio, because it'll help us to understand why measuring microbes in the soil is so important. So carbon to nitrogen ratio is the ratio of the mass of carbon to the ratio of the mass of nitrogen. So for example, if we have a carbon to nitrogen ratio of 20 to 1, that means we have 20 units of carbon per 1 unit of nitrogen. And every plant has a different carbon to nitrogen ratio. So on the right here, we have this chart that is from the NRCS. It does a really good job of laying out some of our more common materials and the carbon to nitrogen ratio that they have. And it also, here with the turtle and the hare, tortoise and the hare, it does a good job of showing the relative decomposition rate. So how quickly these are going to break down based on their carbon to nitrogen ratio. So first highlighted is the ideal microbial diet at 24 to 1. So when we have 24 units of carbon per 1 unit of nitrogen, that is when our microbes are going to be functioning at the ideal level. But that means that if we're only giving the system 24 units of carbon and 1 unit of nitrogen, we're not going to have really anything left over. There's not going to be any carbon or any nitrogen left over, because that's just the functional level, the ideal level for those microbes to be able to function. So we have to feed them more in order to get some of these other benefits of these microbes. But there's a balance in terms of soil health between putting residue out there that's going to keep the soil covered and protect the soil from erosion and you know, maintain those soil moisture levels, but also decomposing in a way that's going to help your microbes. So it really is a balance and something to consider when we're planting all of our cash crops, but also when you're incorporating cover crops into the system. Different cover crops are going to do better in, you know, based on their carbon to nitrogen ratio in terms of breakdown. So let's take a look at this. Possibly. All right. So it's not highlighting, but I want to look here at this rye cover crop, this cereal rye cover crop, which is 2 steps above the ideal microbial diet. We have a cereal rye cover crop in the vegetative stage at a 26 to 1 carbon to nitrogen ratio, which means that we have 26 units of carbon and 1 unit of nitrogen, which is just above that ideal microbial level. And what this means is that if you're terminating your rye cover crop, like we've seen in our examples from the Soil Health Partnership data, if you're terminating that rye cover crop 2 weeks prior to corn planting, you're going to get a good amount of rye on the surface, but those microbes are going to burn through that residue pretty quickly because it's pretty close to their ideal. And there might be a little bit of carbon or a little bit of nitrogen left over, but really not a whole lot is going to be left over. And it's going to be 4, 5, 6 weeks, possibly depending on your environmental conditions, before that decomp starts to release some of those nutrients, specifically nitrogen, back towards your growing cash crop. And so that's just one example. If we look up here now at corn stover towards the top, towards our tortoise here, we see a carbon to nitrogen ratio of 57 to 1, which means 57 units of carbon. Now that is quite a few more units of carbon than our ideal of 24, which means that in order for our microbes to be able to process corn stover, they're going to have to dig into the nitrogen stores that are in the soil or other nitrogen sources in order to break down that carbon. They need more of that nitrogen in order to process the carbon, which is going to leave you with a nitrogen deficit in your soil. That's only going to become available again when those microbes die and decompose themselves, or when another source of nitrogen becomes available, like your fertilizer, or if you had a cover crop that's gonna release them back into the environment. And so that is why, to me, this result is so interesting. So again, beta-glucosidase is showing enzyme activity in the soil of this particular enzyme, and we're seeing highest levels of this enzyme working in our corn, our only corn treatment. And so that result is really interesting to me, and it's a little bit backwards from what I would have expected. And so I'm really curious in this next year to see how this enzyme level changes, but also in 2 years when we're back into a corn rotation, if this level changes even more. We have 2 additional soil health indicators that I'll cover really quickly. And the first here is soil respiration. Soil respiration is an interesting metric. It is also considered to be a direct metric of microbial activity in the soil. It's basically how much those microbes are releasing carbon dioxide in the soil. It's a measure of the release of carbon dioxide. It's not necessarily a result that you would take as is. So, we're looking right here at the preseason average compared to our treatments again, and we see our corn plus oats plus BioGrow product up to be at about 90 parts per million, which seems like a great result. But the value in tests like this is to see the change over time. And so an increase in soil respiration over time means an increase in that functionality of your microbial environment. A decrease means that there's something going on to where those microbes aren't functioning and they're not releasing, they're not having a lot of activity to release, to respirate even more. And so this is just another one of those results. We're going to have to wait and see how it changes over time, but good to keep an eye on it, at least for now. And the other one is a soil health score. Now, there are a number of soil health scores out there. This particular one takes into account soil respiration, water extractable organic carbon, and water extractable organic nitrogen. Generally has a score of between 0 and 50. So again, we're looking at the preseason average to be about 8. And the corn plus oats plus BioGrow additive up to be about 13. This score is not necessarily something that you're going to go to your neighbor, or whatever at the next field day and say, oh, well, I have a soil health score of 12, because there's not enough context there in terms of comparing it to your neighbor. But it would be a really great way to compare on your personal farm, maybe 2 fields that are managed a little bit differently, or within the same field if you have different soil texture types or different management on halves of a field or something like that. So again, this is something that's really good to track over time and just see if you can improve that score and get it up into those 20s or 30s. The last thing I want to point out here is that if we're looking at these side by side, we're seeing sort of mirror images of each other, right? And so we're seeing the corn plus oats plus BioGrow additive at a pretty high level. The corn plus oats is the second highest one, and that's because soil respiration is a large part of the soil health score. So you're kind of folding one into the other, and we would expect those results to kind of mirror each other. Finally, I have yield to show here. Our yield is fairly low for some of these. So the corn plus oat cover crop plus Nutrilink Biosystems product is coming in at 136 bushels per acre compared to our highest, which is our corn plus oats cover crop at 150 bushels per acre. And so pretty variable, a little bit low from what I would like to see. And again, this is just something we'll have to come back to. Next year is a soybean year, but in 2 years, as we've built up some of these, hopefully microbial communities and some other soil health benefits, can we increase these yield values in any way? As far as preliminary conclusions from this, I'm not prepared today to choose a treatment. I do think that this corn plus oats plus Nutrilink additive is at the bottom in nearly every test, including some that I didn't show here today. We also have some plant stand counts and some other measurements and other soil health indicators that I just didn't have time to show here today. But it's at the bottom. And so we'll see how that continues. And I think if I had to pick something today, it's a toss-up between the corn plus oats plus BioGrow treatment and just the plain corn plus oats treatment. Of course, with the BioGrow product, you're going to have an additional expense in that product. And so possibly I'd be leaning more towards the corn plus oats, but we'll have to see over time if we can get any benefit out of these biological additives. Okay. So that was 2020. I want to briefly touch on what the future holds in terms of our research with our partners on soil health and carbon sequestration in 2021 and beyond. So this first project here, again, is with Mid-Michigan Agronomy. They've been a great partner for us. I'm looking forward to continuing that previous project and starting this new project, looking at soil health and carbon. So I think that carbon sequestration is the popular thing right now. It's what everybody wants to know about. You know, farmers want to know if there's a way that they can not only be involved in this whole carbon discussion, but how maybe they could actually get paid for carbon credits on their farm. And I don't want to get too deeply into this whole carbon market, carbon sequestration discussion, because I think that's such a huge topic. It's such an important topic. But we just don't have time today to really get into it. And of course, it has implications as far as what's happening in your field out here, but also ethanol and market development and just so many other aspects. And so I think that that's just something we'll have to cover at a different time. But we are very interested in this topic just as much as you are, and we're starting to see how we can be involved, especially from a research standpoint. So this particular trial has a couple of goals to strengthen the understanding of soil carbon stores as it relates to sustainable agriculture practices, and to provide a baseline data set that will help to move the industry forward and have an impact on market opportunities, ultimately to enhance the opportunities of Michigan corn farmers associated with carbon and biofuel markets that potentially or even very likely will come online at some point in the near future. This is planned to be a 3-year study on 2 farms in Michigan. And as far as the data collection goes, they are collecting soil data from 2 Michigan corn growers using 5 soil health analysis methods that are leading the discussion on quantifying the soil carbon profile. And they're also comparing carbon data on fields with growers that are comparing standard tilling practices to fields with minimal or no till practices, and also implementing cover crops over this 3-year period. So it's a complex study. They're looking at sort of 2 different factors, you know, the actual sustainable ag practices and then how that impacts their carbon levels in the soil. And so looking forward to seeing what they come up with. The second and final project here is with Dr. Bruno Basso of MSU. Bruno has been working in this space pretty extensively over the past couple of years. And he's got a pretty interesting and pretty novel way of thinking about this whole carbon sequestration thing. And so the goal of his project is to develop a system capable of quantifying carbon credits generated by the implementation of prescription maps of variable rate fertilizers. Basically a system for converting nitrogen into a carbon dioxide equivalent that can be then sold on a voluntary carbon market. And it sounds kind of like a complicated process, but the benefit to this is that it's entirely digital, and it's using precision technology that is already in place on a lot of farms with pretty minimal additional inputs in terms of management data or time from the farmer in interpreting some of the data that might come out of this digital area. So the process is to first create a yield stability map, looking at areas of the field that might historically produce less than other areas of the field. From that, create a prescription nitrogen fertilizer map, and then compare that map to the as-applied nitrogen fertilizer map. The difference between what should be applied and what is applied being the total nitrogen saved, converting that into carbon dioxide equivalent, and then turning those into actual credits that could be sold in a market somewhere. And so I think there's a lot of economic benefits of reducing nitrogen that will also be looked at. And it's not here on the slide, but he is also adding layers of complexities and considering different sustainable agriculture practices on top of all of this. And so two very different ways to look at this carbon issue. And we will certainly keep you updated on how these are going throughout the year and throughout the next couple of years, as they are multi-year projects. This is my last slide. I just didn't want to leave anybody out. We are supporting, of course, other priorities for 2021 research. We are continuing to look at tar spot with Dr. Marty Chilvers. He and his students are doing an excellent job testing a whole variety of different management strategies for controlling tar spot. We're also continuing in year 3 with Dr. Asan Ghane from MSD, looking at controlled drainage on phosphorus reduction. Dr. Aaron Burns is doing some great work on integrated weed management. This particular project is really exciting for me because it's really complex, and they're looking at hybrid selection and cover crops and soil health and weed management and economic data and just kind of everything. So I'm really excited for that one. And then Dr. Eddie Thompson predicting agronomic performance from genomes of corn, different corn varieties. So lots of exciting things coming in terms of research. And that's what I've got.
Well, thanks, Kristen. I think this was a lot of very good, excellent insight. One of the questions that we do have is, and again, this is a topic that we could probably spend another session on as well, and that's around what is the value of the carbon credits. And do we actually have any numbers or companies out there that have kind of expressed what they're willing to pay at this point?
Yeah, it's such a complex topic, and that's a hard question to answer because, as you say, there are so many companies out there, some of them private, some of them nonprofit. The government is getting involved now. And so in terms of the value of carbon, we've seen values anywhere from $10 an acre up to maybe $50 an acre, depending on the program and the practices. Some of these are relying on paying for the actual outcome. So you have to be able to prove an increase in carbon in your soil. And then some are paying for the practice. So you just simply have to, not simply, of course, it's a management change, but if you just implement no-till, for example, then that would be a payment. And John Maxim in the chat there, he's always a great resource. He just said 10-20 per ton of carbon, and that's right. I didn't say the per ton, I don't think. So we're seeing anywhere from 10 to up to $50 per ton of carbon.
So with that, that's a challenge that's coming forward. Of course, being able to quantify what those values are, being able to quantify exactly how many tons you do have or will sequester. You do need to look at what about the fact that I've already been doing some of these conservation issues prior to, do I get a benefit or do I get penalized? So there is still a lot to be determined in this particular market. Again, we are intimately involved in this because there is some legislation that will be coming forward. We want to make sure that legislation is something that will be beneficial to our growers that are out there. So we are watching this very closely, and the fact that we do have Kristen on staff is going to help us be a key driver in those discussions as we move forward. So with that, I think we pretty well have. I think we've got all of the questions. We do have two more. Considering using cover crop after wheat harvest, Ibelstrel, what cover crop would your choice, and would it be beneficial going to corn next spring?
Yeah, that's a great question. That's one we get all the time. My personal recommendation is to start off with something, if you're new on this cover crop journey, to start off with something that is perhaps a little bit easier to manage, and that could be like an oat cover crop. But after wheat, gives you such a great opportunity because you're going to be able to potentially get a lot of extra growth from that. And so you could potentially look into doing a three-way cover crop mix of a grass, a legume, and a brassica, which are going to give you a lot of extra benefits when you're starting to mix those species in terms of nutrient management, cycling. They are a little bit more difficult to manage when you start getting more species in there, difficult to terminate. But I just recommend that you talk to your agronomist, or you can reach out to me independently, and we can talk about a strategy if you want to get deeper into what your goals are, what the timings could be, and what your availability is in terms of equipment and time.
So one other question, and this will probably be the last question. Have you done research or will you be doing research on what the effects of the crop following a cover crop that was terminated via herbicide versus tillage?
Yeah, I can't think immediately of any result to share with you from previous research. That is information that the Soil Health Partnership does have. So as part of our pretty extensive management data collection, we know exactly what cover crops are out there and how they were terminated, and the crop that was going after that, and the yield of that crop, and also the performance of that crop agronomically from our in-field observations. But I just don't think that's something that's not a question that's specifically been looked at in terms of the analysis yet, but that's certainly a great consideration.
And again, Jim, you brought up a point, and Chris and I also want to ask for further information. You mentioned about getting in contact with you directly. Again, do you have your email address? How do we do that?
Yeah, absolutely. If you have any additional questions on this topic, if you want to see any of the slides that I present today, or if you want to talk about developing a cover crop strategy for your farm, you can email me at kpoley, K-P-O-L-E-Y, at micorn.org.
And again, I think that if we go to the website, Jim, we probably would be able to access that information as well, correct?
Yes, and also then in the chat function, we do have listed Kristen's email address as well. So with that, I guess I'd just like to do one little recap before I turn it back to you, Terry. Hopefully all of the people that have been joining us for the past 12 weeks get a good understanding of all the things that we are doing here at the Corn Marketing Program and the Corn Growers Association. You know, we started off this series talking about tar spot. Then we went into some grain marketing issues and some the things around reports. Trade was another issue. Again, those are the markets that we concentrate on, both not only in grain, ethanol, but meats. We just, again, we try to focus that for our growers as well. And then, obviously we got into what's happening in DC and Lansing. Weather is another one. And Kristen brought up some work that we've been doing with Dr. Bruno Basso around Greener Future Farms. Again, the digital aspect of things that we're working on. Again, back to trade with China and our relationship with them. We did get into some transportation issues as well. Some mental health issues we did a couple weeks ago. And then ethanol. Probably want to close out with that is the fact that what we are talking about with all this carbon is going to be the new Generation Fuels Act that we are currently working on along with other states to increase the amount of ethanol that we have in our fuels, because we know that we can actually sequester carbon out of our atmosphere. And that is something that the battery vehicles are unable to do, but we are able to pull some of the carbon that's in the atmosphere out through the green growing plants that we have. So there's a reason why that we're focusing on this whole carbon sequestration, but it's really a passion of mine. As when I was going to college back in the early 80s, grew up in Central Illinois, and that was a issue that we had. If some of us have been around a while, remember T by 2000. We were having a lot of wind and soil erosion. As I traveled from college back home, which was about a 45-minute drive, in that nice, black, deep, dark soils in central Illinois, you had to be careful because it was much like in the wintertime where you would have a blizzard. What this blizzard was black, and it was all the soil that was blowing, and that used to really upset me to watch how these guys who owned this ground was just letting that soil go. And that's actually when we started to go through conservation tillage, and we ditched the moldboard plow and we went to conservation tillage, and that's been a passion of mine ever since. Had the opportunity to meet Bill Dietrich with DMI Equipment. Many of you remember the old blue and white wagons, the blue and white big plows. And he sat down at my niece's graduation and gave me a real quick education about burning up carbon and how we've got to stop using some of the tillage system in order to keep that carbon on our soils. So that's been a lifelong passion of mine. And so I'm just glad that we're actually doing a little bit better job of focusing on that. With that, Terry, I want to thank you for the last 12 weeks of being with us, being here, being very diligent. As one of our board members said, it was much better to have a professional do this than this other bald-headed guy that usually does it for the corn marketing program. So with that, Terry, thank you very much, and I'll turn it back to you.